Hey everybody, how's it going? Dan Schinder here on Yesshift with
Steven Schinder.
and our guest. We are so honored that legendary music critic and journalist Chris Welch is taking time to join us. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much from the south of London, right?
Absolutely, a pleasure. Yeah, way down south in
Great.
London.
Awesome. Folks, if you're watching us live or even on the archive, chime in. Tell us where you're watching from. Throw some questions out for Chris. He's worked with, it would probably be easier to name who you haven't worked with. But for you drummers out there, you're going to find this interesting. When Chris joined Melody Maker way back in the Stone Age, 1964, even I was very young then. His trial interview was with legendary drummer Joe Morello. We'll get into that a little later. I've got to ask you about that. But then your first couple of interviews were with the American vocal group Shangri-Las, with the Shangri-Las my wife just loves, and a flash in the pan artist Eric Clapton, bless his heart, from that short-lived band The Yardbirds, some people may have heard of, all the way to fast forward to working with Kerrang and Megadeth and Motorhead and Iron Maiden. The list just goes on and on. Led Zeppelin, if some of you have heard of Zeppelin or Led Zeppelin, Peter Grant, yes, goes on and on. And Chris, I have to tell you, I loved your book. Before we get to Keith's book, I gotta tell you, I loved your book, Yes, Close to the Edge, the story of Yes. I borrowed it from Steven. I loved it so much, it took me 4 years to give it back to him.
Oh, I thought,
And the reason I didn't buy my own copy is because there was something special about reading the one that Steve had.
I thought you were going to say it took 4 years to read it. But,
No. But
I'm very proud of that. Yeah, very pleased to have been asked to do that. Yeah.
just some wonderful works through the years. But I'm going to let Steve kick it off, getting into this amazing, really amazing work of art, the way you've arranged the storyline of the book for Keith. And we had Aaron Emerson and his wife Jo on last week, but now we get to hear from the author. So Steve, take it away with Chris.
Right. So first off, for those who may not know the whole story, how did you first become aware of Keith Emerson and his playing back in the day?
Well, I first met Keith back in 1967. I'd seen him playing with a band called the VIPs, and before that, the T-Bones. That was his early groups. But I didn't know him then. I just saw him on the stage, rock festival or in a club somewhere. And of course, he was then just playing the Hammond organ. And then there was a band that I used to play with, actually, or I write about, called The Attack. With a singer called Richard Sherman and a guitar player called Davey O'List. And I thought they had something, they were going to be a hit, but they weren't. And then Davey phoned me one day, the guitar player, and said, we're getting a band together. Would you like to come and have lunch with us? So I went to their flat, which was in Earl's Court, and very cramped, tiny little flat upstairs. And there was an upright piano in the corner. And sitting at the piano was Keith Emerson. And that's how we met.
Wow.
And we didn't actually talk. He just played me the piano for a minute.
So you both must have been, I guess, like mid-20s then, right? If even that old.
Yes.
Like 23, 25.
Yeah, I'm a bit older than Keith, but I was born in 1941 during the war. So 45, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
So, we were both Scorpios. I think that's how we got on so well.
Oh,
both
nice.
The birthdays.
That's great.
Yeah. What was it like witnessing in real time the evolution of Keith from the Nice to Emerson, Lake and Palmer from like the 60s to 70s?
Well, the great thing about The Nice originally, I thought they were one of the first progressive rock bands when they did that album for Immediate Records, and the single they did, Thoughts of Emily's Dabjack, which you've probably heard, I guess.
Yeah, I've listened to it. It's great.
Yeah.
Great fun. And it was a wonderful group. I used to go and see them all the time, but their first gigs in small pubs, and then eventually the Marquee, which was the showcase gig in London.
So wait, back up a moment there. How interesting, Chris, is it to have seen an artist that you saw at the Marquee in small pubs and then like Wembley? I mean, that's got to be pretty mind-blowing when you really look back and put that in perspective, right?
Yes, it is. Well, that era was mind-blowing, really. As a reporter on Melody Maker, it wasn't just the nice and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I was covering all the other bands that were all becoming successful via the same route, really. I think that was the thing with British bands. They had that training, playing to small crowds in pubs, and that kind of grounded them a bit and learned how to appeal to an audience, but at the same time be experimental, take risks and insist that they play their own music. That's the great thing about all of those bands. And that's why I call it progressive rock, actually. I think I'm guilty of giving it that name.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when you look at from pub to arena, what that says about how much music and live music means to people, to have seen it evolve to that over the years when the economy really allowed for that. You know, these days there's not as many jets waiting on the tarmac for bands and truckloads of brinks, you know, with gold bricks backing up to people's homes and front doors. But it says a lot about what that music movement meant, and especially progressive rock. And being the person credited for that term, for someone that landed from Mars or say Leicester for that matter, or Wyoming, how would you describe progressive rock?
Well, freedom, I think, is the first thing to say, and bringing together all the strands of music that adventurous musicians would want to listen to. You know, people who actually studied their instruments and wanted to play them better. Because rock and roll was great, and the simplicity of the average rhythm and blues band was terrific as well. But these were musicians like Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson, and Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull. They all had roots in classical music and jazz as well. So bringing them all together, the strands of that type of music, those different types of music, wasn't so unreal if you think about it. And there was this great freedom coming from America too, like Frank Zappa and the whole hippie era. You had to be free and you had to experiment. I think that's what underpinned the whole progressive rock movement. Was that movement. We want to explore and do something new.
So much came out of that era that still is so ahead of its time. One of my favorite examples of that is Carnival 9, you know, those three, the trilogy album, Tarkus, and over to Yes with Close to the Edge and Tales from Topographic Oceans. Any one of those pieces I mentioned could come out today, and they're mind-blowingly ahead of their time. You know, it's just only by the sound of the production in most cases could one who has a seasoned ear sort of pinpoint about when it came out. But aside, you know, sonic qualities aside, just by composition and performance and lyrics, they're timeless. They really are.
They are. It's extraordinary music. And the great thing, I think, is the fact that they were given freedom in the studio. You know, until then, the Beatles and Stones era, it was still pretty much 3-minute singles that you were expected to do. And they did miracles with that, of course. And then suddenly you were allowed to sit with, say, Eddie Offord, the engineer, in the studio, Advision in London. Right? And you could sit there for hours, you know, you weren't restricted to a very short session.
Yeah. And I saw earlier that 49 years ago today is actually when Topographic Oceans came out. So today, people are still talking about it. But
49 years.
Is it that long? Oh, God.
Yeah, it'll be 50 next year. So that's quite true. Yeah. And also Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you know, their legacy has still transcends. Unfortunately, I also saw earlier that 6 years ago today is when we lost Greg Lake, and you know it's really sad that we lost him as well. But their music is still talked about, like they were so influential on the prog rock movement, and you know that's still alive today, which is very gratifying to see that this genre is still going strong and still fondly remembered all those things back in the day.
And of course, Greg was a very important part of the LP's success by being a fantastic lyricist and a wonderful singer, all-round musician, guitar player. Yeah, and it's tragic to think that that's the anniversary. Awful.
Yeah, interesting.
Are there any stories from the road from back in the 70s or 60s even that you're able to share, like with any of those guys?
Well, yes, because I went to their first performance at the well, it was the second actually, but it was the one that was regarded as their first showcase. It's the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, and I was filming it actually with my little cine camera, and I saw the moment when the cannon went off, which was very funny. They had this brass cannon and they exploded. Well, there were two brass cannons,
Right.
and there was an Italian photographer jumping on the stage where he was not supposed to be there. He was desperate to get a close-up shot, and he was standing right next to the cannon when it went off, and it blew him across the stage.
Wow.
It was only in harmless gunpowder, nothing too not too explosive. And that was, of course, the breakthrough for us. And the audience went mad, and the press wrote it up. Well, I certainly wrote it up, and henceforth, ELP became a supergroup. Yeah, after that second gig, very fast.
After that show, Chris, literally right after that show, and people are walking back to their cars and whatnot, what was the chatter like? Because most people had never even heard a piece of music by them, and then here's these three gentlemen on stage just playing mind blowing. What was in the air that night?
Well, yeah, I think you could sense the excitement. I was right in the front row, so I don't know how they heard the back, but you could certainly hear the cheering and or the yelling, and it was an incredible bill. I mean, it was Jimi Hendrix was on that bill, and the who did an amazing set as well. But Emerson, Lake and Palmer came on just the right time, and it was dusk, so when the sun set in, and people were cheering and yelling, and they'd not heard anything like it, really.
Yeah.
There may have been a few nice fans in the audience, but for everybody else, it's a revelation.
It literally catapulted their career.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And from then on, of course, they weren't playing small pubs anymore. They were touring. I was very fortunate. I was invited to go on tour with them. And, I went to New York and saw them at Fillmore East in New York. I don't know if you ever managed to get there. Did you, Dan?
I didn't know. You mentioned Jimi Hendrix, and I think if there's ever a person that knows the answer to this question, it could certainly be you, Chris. Is there any truth to that myth that Jimi Hendrix was considered to join the band and they were going to call it Help? Or did all that just stem from them being on the same stage at the Isle of Wight together?
Well, of course, Keith had been on stage with Jimmy at the Royal Albert Hall when he was in the Nice. They did one of those packages, which were quite extraordinary. It was like 15 minutes per band. Pink Floyd, 15 minutes.
So they each got one song. Yeah, all along the Watchtower. Yeah.
And Jimmy was very impressed when he saw Keith playing, especially when he was tipping the Hammond organ up and rolling it around the stage. Showmanship, and Jimmy, Keith was the Jimi Hendrix of the Hammond organ.
Can you imagine at the same time if that were to happen, Keith rocking the Hammond organ, sticking daggers in it, while Jimmy's teething his Stratocaster and then lighting it on fire? Like, what is show? That's almost too much.
I think there would have been too many egos there. I don't think he thought Jimmy would have tolerated that. But funnily enough, Keith's roadie told me he fixed rollers on the Hammond organ.
Make it easier.
It weighs a ton, doesn't it, a Hammond organ?
Yeah.
So that's how he got it across the stage, on rollers. Small ones, but But whether Jimmy would have got involved in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, is that what you're thinking? Might have happened?
Yeah, if there's any truth to that myth.
No, I don't think so. No, I think they were looking at Mitch Mitchell was the drummer for the ELP. That was on the cards at one point when they were looking around for a drummer. And he may have come to a rehearsal, I'm not sure. I went to one of the early ELP rehearsals, actually.
Oh, wow.
And Carl was definitely the drummer, yeah. I just remembered, actually. I was actually there before they played a gig.
Wow.
And they did, they tested Carl, and they had to play 21st Century Schizoid Man.
Oh, how interesting that they would try that. But it makes sense, something that at least Greg knows and Keith could play. That's cool. Yeah.
And Carl was very worried about it, because I knew him from drumming with the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And he was a fantastic drummer. I'd go and see him wherever I could.
Right.
And then we got the gig with he was Atomic Rooster for a while.
Atomic Rooster,
and then
right.
and I was in the studio and then rehearsing. And he'd been up all night trying to remember how to play 21st Century Schizoid Man, which Greg wanted to do. And they played it, got through it, remembered all these tricky rhythms,
Right.
and then they never played it on the gig. So
Right.
they dropped it.
How interesting.
It's his test.
Yeah. Going back to the new book for Keith, and I'll show some images while we're talking about it. One of the things I've mentioned to Steve, and by the way, we read it literally together while we were on a trip together. It was the most quiet we've ever been in a room for 2 hours together. We were both rifling through reading it. And I mentioned to Steve, and I mentioned this with Joe and Aaron, what's interesting to me about the style and way you assembled this book, and then Steve will ask you some things about the process, is that it's not like there's many different people that appear in the book, but it's not like this person's whole, so it's not like Alan White's whole story, then Rick Wakeman's whole story, then this. It's everybody as they appear chronologically in the entire timeline. And I love how it's arranged like that. It made it a lot easier to sort of keep track of things and see how pieces fit together over time, because there was many things I read about, but then there were many more things inserted in between that helped stitched all those things together over the years. Thought that really was interesting.
Yes, it's like a tapestry, isn't it? And,
Yeah.
Actually, I can't claim credit for all of that, I have to say, because Mal Peachy was the editor from Rocket 88, the publishing company. And, when we first discussed the book, he said he wanted it to flow, so it wouldn't be just one person's view and that's it, and then move on to the next person. Right. So I did all the interviews over a period of about, I think it's about 6 months actually, and very intense.
Sounds like it, yeah.
People, but very personal memories, and you sometimes wonder, will they want to talk about this? About Keith's demise and what happened to him, and his life story, and talking to relatives. It's all very emotional for me, actually, as well as for the reader. I think it's quite an emotional experience. But I think it worked the way you described it. That's what happened. And Mel Peachy, the editor, was very instrumental in making sure that all my interviews sort of they weren't just packaged up and dumped.
That's great. Mal did a genius job of that. And I love how, actually, if I may credit Steve for putting it, that in reading it, it's just like watching a documentary where you're cutting back and forth to different people throughout the timeline, rather than, like you said, packaging each interview separately. It works so much better. It's great. And I'm going to show some pictures while you guys talk about the product. It's beautifully put together.
Right. So that pretty much answers what I was wondering, which was how long it took and what the process was like. But were there ever any challenges in the course of writing this biography?
Yes, there were. Yes, obviously, when I was speaking to Murray, he's his partner, and we had to discuss what happened to Keith in his final days. When he was suffering depression and taking antidepressants, and he was very concerned about his health. And we wanted to I wanted to talk to Murray about what Keith's mood was and why he did what he finally did. And as we all know, he took his own life, which was disastrous and tragic. But she was very kind and very sensitive, and explained to me quite at length, actually. We didn't use all of her interview. I have to say it was much longer originally, but obviously there's some personal things probably best left unsaid.
Right.
So for everybody's sensitivity, but she did describe to me Keith's mood, and came to the conclusion that it was really about the problem with his hand, particularly his right hand, which had been developing over some years. When he'd had an operation on it, which is probably not a good idea if you're a pianist, messing about bones and muscles. And, I don't think it was the wise decision to do that. In fact, Carl Palmer, I think, advised Keith not to have an operation in his hand in the first place. But then in there, without going into all the details, but it can be read in a book.
Yeah.
but
Right.
but that was an emotional interview for me, and Mari was very, very helpful and understanding, and described Keith's mood and the events that led up to him taking that fatal decision.
Yeah. I want to thank you for sharing that and thank Mari for being so brave and spending that time with you. I met her the same night that I mentioned to you before we started that I met Keith, which was in Beverly Hills at Carl Palmer's art reveal, where I interviewed Carl the first time. That was back then. And then I've seen her a couple times since at a couple of guest concerts. And Mari, if you're watching, thank you for your comments on our previous interview with Aaron and Joe. And thank you again for opening up with Chris, because, you know, we can only imagine how sensitive that was, but you're very brave for sharing your story with everybody. Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah. And the book also, it does a great job of illustrating the type of person he's very good humored, and it was just nice having those moments and seeing all those different accounts from all the people you interviewed. It felt like, really getting to know him and what his like jokey sense of humor was like, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, because most people only see who we think is on stage or in the video. We're on the album cover, especially back in our older days, Chris, and we come up with a model of that world that often is just a construct. And when we get that peek beyond the curtain, like you've so well done with these interviews, like Steve said, you really get to know the person, and it was so nice to read so many kind anecdotes about his personality, how he was as a father and a husband, a partner with Mari, and just how he was with bandmates. And it was very, very revealing, and all in a positive way.
Yes, it was fun talking particularly to people that worked with him, like Rocky, the roadie, and the wonderful stories he told about getting lost in a hotel in New York and breaking in. Did you read that story?
I did, yeah. And the guy is right in there in the bathroom.
And we get insight into the special effects, like the burning of the piano. That's a great story.
Yeah. And one of the things I don't want to spoil this, so I'm not going to say the whole thing, but folks, one of the things, not a complete spoiler, but there's to me anyways, a mind-blowing, surprising thing about the twirling piano. So if anyone's familiar with the twirling piano from one of the Cal Jam shows, there's some interesting things about that in there that made me just go, whoa, had no idea. So no matter how much you think you know about Keith or ELP, there's some really, really neat stuff in here that were just beautiful buried gems.
Great. Wonderful, yeah.
Chris, how about for you, having been attached to that world for so long, was there something that came out in any of the interviews that surprised you or was new to you?
I think there were, yes. There were moments I was surprised at. And, yes, you think you know somebody. The thing about Keith was that he was such a daredevil. We were painting a picture of him being depressed. That's not how he was most of the time.
Right.
He had an sense of humour. And he was great at playing practical jokes on people. There's the story about his ancient house that he owned, this beautiful baronial manor with Eleanor. And they lived in the country and they had this very old mansion. Well, it's not a mansion, it's more like a 15th century cottage, I suppose.
Right.
And he invited guests to stay in the guest room overnight, and he had to have a room next door to the guest room. Oh, before they went to bed, he said, by the way, the house is haunted. And,
he would tell us ghost story first, prime them.
That's right. And then, of course, the guy goes to bed and he hears this horrible moaning and groaning and clanking chains. And there's Keith in the next room rattling in
the adjacent closet wall, right? Basically.
Which I thought was funny.
Yeah, that's a good one for sure. That's funny. When I met him, and I'm going to show a picture that you won't be able to see until you watch the replay if you do, but I met him, talked to him a bit, and then I did my interview with Carl. Then we hung out in this art gallery that was a beautiful old, almost like a library in someone's home almost. And I went over to a bookshelf. My wife and I collect books. We have old books. So I'm a bookworm. I'm looking at the bookshelf. Now, the corner of my eye, I see Keith walk up looking at books, and I'm not going to bother him. Yeah, I'm just there looking at books. And then he says, "Hey, Dan." And I turn, I said, "Yes." And he holds up Neil Zauwauser's book, Fuck You. And he says, "I think this is for you." I said, "Oh, okay, thanks." I said, "Let's get a picture together with it." He says, "Well," I said, come on, let's get a picture. So I give the camera to Lori Shube, who was the chief digital officer for Trump Talk TV for years. And Keith's not smiling. I said, "Keith, please smile." He says, "Only if I get to give the finger." I said, "We'll both give the finger." So that's the picture I'm showing. He's holding up their book. I got my arm around him, and we're both telling everyone that they're number one. So there you go. So I learned in just the short time I spent with him that he did love the sort of practical joke aspect, but it was also very, very kind and almost shy and soft-spoken and soft-hearted. And having met him for the first time, I thought, I don't know if that's how he is all the time. After reading the book, I felt like I met the real Keith Emerson, and that was very heartwarming for me.
Yes, you can get that from all the musicians that you work with. They all have. Yeah. That's what we would say of them. Jeff Skunk Baxter, and he's very full of praise. They only played together for a short while, didn't they? Jeff Skunk Baxter from Steely Dan. And he described him as the greatest keyboard player in the world, which I thought was great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What's interesting is the first time I became aware of Keith Emerson, I was born in 1994, so I was pretty young, but in about early 2008, I got the classic artists Yes documentary, which I'm holding up here, and Keith was in that, and you as well. Like, all of the interviews in this are great. I understand. Yeah, I understand this was a series. There's one on Cream and one on the Moody Blues. What was that whole project like? If you can talk about it a bit.
Yes, that was a whole series of interviews, which was wonderful for me, going to America and tracking down all these wonderful musicians.
Yeah,
like the Moody Blues and out Denny Lane. That was fun. We went out into the desert. We went to Las Vegas to film an interview with Denny Lane. And,
oh, wow.
We went out into the Red Desert. Yeah, but I didn't get to go gambling, unfortunately. But the funny thing, we interviewed Denny, the crew, and me, and then we wanted to find the nearest bar we could find. And there was like in the Wild West, really. It was out in the desert, and we found this bar. And there was this chap all on his own playing the piano, and he was really good. He was playing like Elton John. And then he thought, "This is fantastic." And we all started cheering and joining in. And I think we thought he'd been discovered. We'd made his day. Nobody else was listening to him at all. So out of the blue came this British prog rock band.
About what year was that, Chris?
It would have been about 1982. I can't remember when we did it now, actually. Yes, it was a few years ago. Yeah. Become a bit of a blur.
Interesting.
And Mike Pinder played the opening for Go Now. Do you remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was fun to do, yeah. And we met Eddie Offord when we were doing the Yes documentary on his yacht. He had a yacht down in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And it's freezing cold day, and he was plying me with beer, you see, lager. And I had to keep rushing to the loo every 5 minutes. Which is rather embarrassing.
That's funny.
Yeah, I see a couple comments. Peter De Amore says, "I loved Chris Welch on that DVD." I assume referring to the Classic Artist Yes DVD. And another author, Dave Watkinson, says, "A legend of music journalism. Hi, Chris. Thanks for just doing what you've always done. The Melody Makers movie/program was great." And he also asks, when is the Chris Welch autobiography going to be a thing?
For goodness sakes.
People keep asking me that. And the trouble is I keep ending up writing other people's biographies. But no, I should do it. I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. I have a lot of memories, as you can tell. So I'll be very happy to do that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. For our Drum Talk TV fans and other fans of drummers and other people very interested in your very beginnings. How did that trial interview come up in 1964 when you joined Melody Maker and they wanted to, I guess, try you out and gave you Joe Morello, legendary jazz drummer, possibly the first drummer along with Papa Joe Jones to ever do a drum solo on a drum set with his hands, and of course of the famous Dave Brubeck band and the famous track Take Five. What was it like getting with Joe Morello? And how old were you then? You would have been about 23, right, Chris?
Yeah, about 23. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I've been a reporter on a local newspaper for about 4 years, and I was always writing about the local bands. One of them is the Rolling Stones from Dartford, our local band. So,
did they? I've never heard. Did they go far?
I think they did quite well. I gave them a very good review. So. But yeah, I was writing, and of course at that time, Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry and Rhythm and Blues was happening, and there were lots of blues bands. So, and I started writing about them on the local paper. One of my colleagues said, "Why don't you go and get a job on a weekly music paper?" About 4 or 5 then, NME, New Musical Express, and but I'd always read Melody Maker. That was my favourite paper because it covered everything, all styles of music: jazz, rock and roll, blues, Beatles, Stones.
Nice.
So amazingly, they had a vacancy. I wrote off and I applied for the job, and I told them I was a drummer and I was a journalist and I could type. That was useful. And the editor said, "Well, okay, we'll give you a test." I went up to the office on a Friday and he said, "Well, there's this band called the Dave Brubeck Quartet in town, and there's a drummer, Joe Morello, and nobody knows what to ask drummers. None of the staff here are into drumming. They're all playing the trombone or something." So they said, "Could you go to I think it was Park Lane Hotel or the one of the big hotels, the Hilton. It was the Hilton.
Oh.
Park Lane. On a Sunday night, could you go and interview Joe Morello?" So, as it happened, he was one of my favourite drummers.
I was going to ask. That's great.
Yeah. I loved Sounds of the Loop was my favourite drum solo.
Nice. Oh, yeah.
Which I have on an EP, which I've still got. Just a beautiful piece of drumming. Revelation. And of course, the famous left hand technique.
Yeah.
Dancing.
With the traditional grip. Yeah.
And it was just, I thought, wow, yes, I'd love to go and interview Joe Morello. I was very nervous, actually. I went out on a dark, I think it's quite a wintry night, up to the West End, and found Joe in his hotel room all alone. And he said, "Excuse me, I have a visual problem," meaning that he couldn't see terribly well. So that's the first thing he told me. So,
okay. Yeah, because I know his glasses were quite thick lenses, right?
They were, yes. He was wearing these very thick glasses, and he put me at ease. He was very friendly and polite and gentlemanly. And we sat down and had a really nice interview. No tape recorder, unfortunately. It's all scribbled notes.
Oh.
Scribbling notes. And, they hadn't invented the tape recorder there.
That's funny.
not the cassette one.
Yeah.
You'd have to have a gigantic
small portables, yeah.
Yeah. Walkman, that's what I meant to say. That
right.
hadn't been invented. Anyway, Joe was very, very good, very nice, and I had to rush home, write the story up, type it out overnight, go up to the Melody Maker's office in Fleet Street on Monday morning, gave them the copy, and they said, "How did it go?" And I said, "It was very good, very nice." And they used the piece. It was about 300, 400 words long. And to my astonishment, it appeared in that week's issue with a big byline, and the headline was something Joe had said to me: "You don't have to be an idiot to play the drums." I think he was thinking about some rival drummers.
That's so funny.
Idiot.
Yeah, that's hilarious. He would have been what? Maybe was he like 10 years your senior, Chris?
Yes, he would have been.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he'd have been like early 30s. Yeah.
But I knew as a journalist you have to take one quote out and use it as the intro, and it made a good headline, I thought. But
yeah.
That's just one of the things.
Back in those early days, would you have, well, with this interview in particular, and then subsequent ones with Eric Clapton, then the Shangri-Las, would a photographer have gone with you, or were you also responsible for taking the picture if there was to be one at the session?
Well, I've often thought back how primitive the way we operated. And no, I didn't take a photographer with me. I didn't have a tape recorder. It's all scribbled notes. I'd come back covered in ink. That was my my thumb was always covered in ink from notebooks, old biros, leaky biros. But that first week on Monument, of course, that got me the job. Joe Morello got me the job. They said, "Great, okay, you're on." And can you start Monday? And one of the first groups I met was the Shangri-Las. They were great, wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. And then the next band I interviewed was the Yardbirds. And
oh, nice.
They all came up to the office. In those days, people would come to you to be interviewed. You didn't have to go and see them. So.
Yeah. So Eric was in the band. Was Jeff Beck still in the band?
No, this is pre-Jeff. This is the very young Yardbirds with Eric Clapton and Paul Samuel Smith, Keith Ralph, Chris Dreyer, and Carty. Yeah. And we all went in a coffee bar on Fleet Street to do the interview. And I remember Paul, the bass player, saying, "Can't we go to a pub?" He was quite disgusted. I said, lunchtime. So, and then Eric was standing slightly to the side of the group. They were all very noisy, like kids, shouting and making a scene in the coffee bar, being funny.
Funny.
And Eric sort of looked at me as if to say, "I'm not with this band." So he was very cool and very smartly dressed and just slightly apart from the rest of them. That was the vibe I got.
You seem to have lived up to that as well, right?
Yeah, and they had this single out. What was it? "Good Morning, Little Schoolgirl." That was the song.
Oh, wow. Okay. Going way back, yeah.
And they said, "We hope it won't be a hit." Why? And they said, "Well, then we'll lose all our fans." Because, fans are very pernickety about credibility. If you were a pop star, you didn't have credibility.
Right. Right. You were bubblegum, not a rocker.
Yeah. So I went to see the Yardbirds a few months later after that. The record was smiling hit, and I went to a club in Bromley, actually, not far away, a small club, not many people there. And Eric Clapton looked really fed up and bored. And I went over, I said, "You don't look happy at all. What's the matter?" And he said, "Oh, you noticed, did you? You noticed." A few days later, he left the group. So that was like a hint. He quit.
So did you develop a relationship to some degree over the years, being that you then worked with Cream? And I would think that probably happened with a few different people who you worked with over and over and over through their careers, right?
Yes, well, I was very fortunate. My job consisted of going to a club and seeing a band every night of the week and having a drink with them. So not many jobs like that, actually. Right. So.
Sounds grueling.
And so I got to know the Yardbirds very well, and Martin and Five, and so many bands. Spencer Davis Group, I really know.
Stevie Winwood.
And we'd all go to the pub to do interviews, and by then we'd switch from coffee bars to pubs. But with Eric Clapton, he went off to John Mayall, and I saw Eric with John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and he changed his appearance. He looked more menacing somehow than he had been in the Yardbirds. He'd grown a moustache and a beard, I think he had a moustache. So, and he had this aura of being this remote kind of godlike figure. That's hence God suddenly appeared, painted on all the walls.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
So, I heard God play.
Yeah. Looking ahead, what might we see from you in the somewhat near future that you can talk about?
What, bands or music?
Works from you.
Well, yes. I've done a book about Ginger Baker. I haven't told you the Ginger Baker story yet. Did I tell you that?
I would love that, yeah.
Well, at the Melody Maker one day, Ginger Baker I've interviewed for the Graham Bond organisation. He rang me and said, "Oh, I've left Ginger Baker. I've left Graham Bond, and I'm forming a group with Jack Bruce, and Eric's going to do it as well, Eric Clapton." And I wrote this story about this supergroup with the three of them, and all the managers of the various artists all rang up and said, "It's not true," because they hadn't bothered to tell the bands they were in that they were leaving to form another group, and none of the managers knew.
Oh, funny.
So they denied it all, and then Robert Stigler actually took over and said, no, it's true, they are forming a band. Would you like to come and see them? So I went to Cream's first rehearsal.
Wow. How did they get on? Did they get on okay?
It was very funny. It was in a church hall, and, covered in dust. And there was, like brownies, young girl guides, and they were all at one end of the hall, jumping about, doing whatever it is girl guides do.
How funny.
The games, we were playing games. And at the other end, Ginger Baker had 3-drum kit, just 3 drums, and Jack and Eric, and they were doing a couple of blues numbers. And they started arguing immediately. We made a mistake there. We did that wrong. And Robert Stigler, their manager, came over and whispered in my ear, and he said, "Are they any good?" And I said, yeah, they're great. They're going to be fantastic. Don't worry. I often thought if I told Stigler that they were a load of rubbish, that he might not have signed them and not recorded them. So at that moment, I saved them, I think. Yeah.
That's amazing. I think, Chris, that it's fair to say very possibly that first band, I think, billed as a supergroup, I think that band had the largest impact on the music of the time and generations of musicians of any band that short-lived. In such a short time, the amount of material they cranked out and the impact it had, I don't think has ever been matched or will be.
No, there's Ray Gears, and which is their second album. Yeah, that's right. And well, of course, they were all the best musicians around. That's why I called them supergroup. They're all great. Ginger was a fantastic drummer. Jack was a great singer, harmonica player, bass player, and composer. Yeah. And to get Pete Brown, their lyricist, they just took off immediately. I did see him playing in the Inevitable pub gig. That was fun.
Yeah. Their reunion concert was brilliant. It's one of the best shot concert films as well. That's just a great film from 2006 or 5 or something.
I did that one as well. I just remembered that.
Yeah.
Documentary.
Yeah. At Radio Music Hall. Just a great, great film to watch. I'm going to have to break that out.
Yeah.
Have you seen that, Steve? Have you seen that?
I may have. It's possible I may have seen clips of it. I don't know if I've seen it in full.
It's great. It's great. And Ginger's solo for Toad is just captivating. It was so nice to see them as older gentlemen doing what they started out doing together and just really blowing the roof off. Just fantastic performance, fantastic filming.
Right. Another thing we wanted to ask, we mentioned it earlier, the book Close to the Edge, the story of Yes. And I've read many books, so I'm not exaggerating when I say this is one of my all-time favorite books, just giving in-depth look at Yes's history up to that point that this updated edition came out. One of the things I was wondering is, with all the different interviews and different ways people remember things, how does one juggle contradictory accounts of certain events? How do you make those calls when it comes to putting the whole story together?
Especially with so many members.
Yeah. Yes. Well, when I knew them when there was just the original, the Peter Banks on guitar, and Kay on organ, and that's when I first saw them and met them all. And then as the years went by, gradually more and more people came and went, and it's like a big family. It's a huge family tree, isn't it? And so by the time I came to write the book, I had all the different artists and contributors to Yes, as well as the originals, John and Chris and Bill and Tony Kay. So generous. And yes, it became actually, I'll tell you what happened when I started writing the book. John Anderson said to me, just make it funny. He said, don't be too serious. So that was good advice. But there were contradictory reports, Stephen. That's right. It was, sometimes you had to sort of edit things out that people might say. There was a bit of criticism from Bill of Chris Squire, and the first edition of the book, and I think Chris was a bit upset about that. It's all about when they're on the road and travelling together, and musicians do get on each other's nerves after a while. It's understandable. people turning up late for the gig, or oversleeping, or certain habits, terrible driving skills, nearly crashing the van, that sort of thing could cause problems between them. So I think what happened was I was talking to Bill, and he was complaining about something Chris had done, and I actually quoted him, and I know Chris was a bit upset about that. So we took it out of the later edition. So
right,
yeah. But you have to be careful when you're a journalist. If you can't edit everything out, you've got to leave the important facts there. But just occasionally you have to think about people's feelings, sensitivity. Be aware of that, I think.
Yeah, it really is a balancing act. Yeah.
In your own writing, Stephen, do you find that problem when you're writing? Or?
Well, I'm mostly a fiction writer, but like just from researching things for our show for Yesshift, when I have to look up the context of when certain things came out and what people said, I sometimes find like, oh, they said this, but they said that. So like, what's the real story? Like,
yeah, even when a person contradicts their own statement from another time, that's the funniest. I won't mention any Rick Wakeman names, but sometimes that just happens.
Yeah, it's funny when I talk to musicians years later and I say, "Oh, do you remember that time when you were ill and you had to cancel the show?" And say, "Ill? Oh no, I just didn't want to do it." That was the original story.
That's relatable.
How funny. Okay, well, Chris, thank you so much for spending so much time with us, especially in your evening this Wednesday. We'd love to have you on again sometime and maybe do almost like an anecdotal series with you, telling stories from different interviews and stuff that didn't end up in books. Even though it's somewhat of a family show, we can stretch it a little bit. But we really appreciate it. And we've both, Stephen and I, really have enjoyed this wonderful book about Keith Emerson's life. And folks, the link is in the post.
Yeah,
no matter where you're watching.
KeithEmersonBook.com.
Yep, KeithEmersonBook.com. Wonderfully put together, wonderfully edited by Mal, and of course input from Aaron and Joe Emerson and all the other people that were around and still around from Keith's life. Thank you so much for that, Chris. Well, thanks, Sharon Shevin, for connecting us with you. Thank you, Sharon, as always, so much. And Chris, hang on the line. And while we say goodbye to everybody, thanks for following Stephen and I so much on Yesshift and on Drum Talk TV. And you could check out the audio-only version at anchor.fm at Yesshift. And you can write us at yesshiftpodcast@gmail.com. And you can write questions, comments, suggestions there. And for Drum Talk TV, it's team@drumtalktv.com. Thank you so much, everybody. Happy holidays.
Yeah, and tune in tomorrow for our interview with Claire Hamill at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern US, and 5 p.m. UK time. So, yeah, she has a new album out, and she also guested on the Steve Howe album back in the 70s.
So we're hoping to get more crazy Steve Howe stories. Thanks, everybody.